The exhaustion of being emotionally aware. The tiredness. Nobody sees. There is a kind of exhaustion that sleep does not reach. You have probably noticed this for longer than you have had words for it. A heaviness that persists through rest, through weekends, through periods where nothing particularly demanding was happening, and yet the weight remained. You wake up, and it is already there. You come home from interactions that should have been unremarkable, and find yourself needing hours of stillness just to return to something resembling yourself, though you would struggle to explain to anyone exactly what was taken or where it went. This exhaustion leaves almost no visible evidence. Nothing dramatic happened. No one was cruel. The conversation was fine, and still you are depleted in a way that feels disproportionate, almost embarrassing relative to the apparent cause, so you say nothing. You have learned that saying something tends to produce responses that miss the point entirely, well-meaning advice that addresses the surface of something that lives much deeper. What lives deeper is this. You do not process the world the way most people around you process it. You absorb not just what is said, but the emotional architecture beneath it, the tension carried in someone's tone before they have finished their sentence, the shift in atmosphere that precedes a difficult moment by just enough time for you to brace without anyone noticing. You read emotional information the way others read text, automatically and continuously, because it is not a skill you consciously deploy. It is simply how your perceptual system works. A system running at that sustained level of intake does not get to rest between interactions. Every environment carries emotional data. Every person in proximity generates signals, and your nervous system tracks all of it with a precision that is, in a very literal sense, exhausting. Not because something is malfunctioning, but because the processing is real. The cost is real, and almost none of it has ever been acknowledged as labor by anyone, including, for long stretches of time, yourself. This is what the word sensitive never manages to capture. What you actually experience is closer to a perceptual condition, a different resolution at which you receive and interpret reality, one that comes with genuine advantages and a cost that accumulates quietly across years of social life and emotional absorption. The gap between what you register and what the people around you seem to register is not something you imagine. It is structural, and navigating that gap, day after day while maintaining the appearance of ordinary functioning, is where most of the exhaustion actually lives. This video will not offer you a reframe that makes the difficulty disappear. What it will do is go directly into the psychology of what is happening, how this specific exhaustion was constructed across time, and what it might mean to finally understand it clearly enough that you stop experiencing it as a flaw in your character. You were never just sensitive. There is something that happens when a person grows up perceiving more than the environment around them is equipped to explain. They are given a word for it early, sometimes by a parent, sometimes by a teacher, sometimes by the accumulated weight of being told with varying degrees of kindness that they feel things too much, that they need to develop a thicker skin. The word that gets attached to all of this is sensitive. The problem with that word is not that it is entirely wrong. The problem is that it is so imprecise that it functionally obscures the thing it claims to describe. Sensitivity, as commonly understood, implies a heightened emotional response, something to be handled carefully, worked around. When that becomes the framework through which a person understands their own inner life, they inevitably internalize something damaging. The idea that the way they experience the world represents a kind of excess, a miscalibration. They spend years trying to manage that excess, to approximate the apparent ease with which other people move through experiences that leave them quietly wrecked. What the label never addressed is that what they were actually experiencing was not primarily an emotional phenomenon. It was a perceptual one. The emotionally aware person does not simply feel more. They receive more. Their nervous system processes the social and emotional environment at a granularity that operates beneath what most people consciously register, picking up microshifts in tone, in body language, in the unspoken content beneath the literal meaning of words. Research into high sensory processing sensitivity, a trait identified in roughly 15 to 20% of the population, consistently shows measurable neurological differences in how these individuals process environmental stimuli. The difference is neurological before it is psychological. But the neurological reality was almost certainly never part of the conversation you had about yourself growing up. What you had instead was the label, and the implicit instruction to manage what the label described. So you did. You became skilled at monitoring your own responses in real time, reading the emotional tolerance of the people around you, and adjusting accordingly. You learned to translate your actual inner experience into something smaller and more legible, to environments that could not hold the full weight of the original, and you did this so consistently, for so long, that it stopped feeling like something you were doing and started feeling like simply who you are. That is the first consequential thing to understand clearly. The management is not you. The containment is not your personality. It is a strategy, developed by a perceptual system that learned early that its natural mode of operation was too much for the surrounding world. The strategy made sense, but it was never the same thing as who you actually are beneath it, and the exhaustion you carry is in no small part the exhaustion of sustaining that strategy continuously, for years, without most people ever knowing it was happening at all. The awareness did not diminish. The capacity to receive emotional information at that depth kept operating at full intensity beneath the performance, beneath the carefully calibrated version of you that the world mostly sees. And the distance between what is actually being processed and what is permitted to surface compounds across time in ways that eventually become impossible to simply push through. The tiredness that comes from it is the entirely logical consequence of a system doing real work, at real depth, without acknowledgment, without rest, and without ever having been accurately named. The cost of reading. Every room. Picture the last time you walked into a space where something was off. Not obviously, visibly off, but off in the way you have always been able to detect without being able to immediately explain. Maybe it was a gathering where two people had recently argued, and the argument was still present even though everyone was performing normalcy over the top of it. Maybe it was a person whose tone said one thing, while everything beneath it said something else entirely, and you registered the discrepancy automatically before you had consciously processed what you were receiving. You adjusted, almost certainly without deciding to, because your system learned long ago that reading the room accurately was how you navigated environments safely. You recalibrated your presence, modulated how much of yourself you brought forward, tracked the emotional weather in real time. And then you went home, and you were tired in a way that had no clean explanation, because from the outside, nothing demanding had happened. This is the hidden labor that almost never gets counted. Not just the experience of perceiving emotional complexity, but the behavioral and cognitive work that follows automatically. The continuous real-time processing of social data, the constant calibration of your own presentation, the sustained vigilance of operating in environments where the gap between what is visible and what is actually happening is something only you seem to be tracking. That vigilance does not turn off when the interaction ends. It runs in the background even in spaces that feel safe, because the perceptual system does not differentiate between situations that require its full capacity and situations that technically do not. A nervous system in sustained alert is a nervous system consuming resources. The attentional load of continuous environmental monitoring, the cognitive work of deciding how to respond to information that most people around you are not even receiving, the additional layer of managing your own response so that it remains socially appropriate. All of this draws from reserves that do not replenish at the same rate they are being spent. Researchers consistently document that highly sensitive individuals not only receive more, they process more deeply, with more associations activated, more implications considered, more emotional dimensions integrated before processing resolves. When the volume of incoming information is high, the processing load becomes cumulative in ways the person experiencing it often cannot fully account for. The exhaustion accumulates without ever being properly attributed. It lands as a general heaviness, and because it cannot be tied cleanly to any single identifiable cause, it gets interpreted as a character tendency rather than a consequence of real ongoing labor. The framing is internal, dispositional, quietly self-critical, and it misses the actual mechanism entirely. You have been doing skilled, sustained, complex perceptual and emotional work in nearly every social environment you have ever entered, and almost none of it has ever been counted as work at all. The performer nobody asked you to become. There was no single moment when it happened. It accumulated gradually across hundreds of small interactions, each one teaching you something precise about what was safe to bring forward and what needed to stay behind. A response that landed too heavily. A moment of genuine emotional expression that made someone visibly uncomfortable. The subtle shift in atmosphere that happened when you were too much, too real in a way the environment could not quite hold. You noticed. You always noticed. And you adjusted. The adjustment was not dishonesty. People who have spent years moderating their emotional expression often carry a quiet guilt about it, a sense that there is something fundamentally deceptive in the version of themselves they present to the world. But what actually happened was attunement turned inward, applied to the problem of your own survival within environments that had a limited capacity for what you genuinely were. Being fully yourself in spaces that could not receive you did not produce connection. It produced discomfort, and then the particular loneliness of having been too visible in the wrong direction. So the mask developed, not as a single constructed thing, but as a gradual accumulation of learned modulations. The warmth was real, but the full weight behind it was held back. The care was authentic, but its cost was invisible, processed later and alone in the hours after the interaction when the performance could finally come down. What no one saw was how much energy that containment required. The mask was active management, the continuous monitoring of your own responses in real time, the editing of what wanted to surface before it surfaced, the sustained internal translation of your actual emotional experience into a form that would not overwhelm the people around you. When emotional labor becomes involuntary and continuous, the cost stops being episodic and becomes structural. It is not the exhaustion of a difficult day. It is the exhaustion of a way of being that never fully stops. And here is the secondary cost that runs even deeper. When a person calibrates their expression consistently across years and contexts, they can arrive at a place where they are no longer entirely certain where the calibration ends and the actual self begins. The performance was so practiced, so responsive to the emotional needs of every surrounding environment, that the original signal underneath it became harder to locate. Not gone, but muffled, overlaid with so many adaptive layers that accessing it directly began to require effort. The person nobody asked you to become was built from your intelligence and your care, but built facing outward, and the cost of that construction was paid entirely from the inside. When empathy becomes absorption, most people understand empathy as the capacity to feel what another person is feeling, to recognize their experience from the inside, rather than observing it from the outside. For most people, empathy is something they do. They feel it, they offer it, and then they come back to themselves. That is not what happens for you. When you are in proximity to another person's emotional experience, you do not simply recognize it, you receive it. Recognition maintains a cognitive separation. You understand what the other person is feeling while remaining located in your own experience. Reception dissolves that separation. The other person's emotional state enters your nervous system directly, not as information about them, but as experience happening in you. And the work of distinguishing between what originated in you and what arrived from somewhere else becomes effortful in ways that most people never have to perform at all. This mechanism, which researchers call emotional contagion, operates in everyone to some degree. But in people with high sensory processing sensitivity, it functions with an intensity and lack of voluntary control that moves it well beyond the ordinary range. The other person's grief does not make you sad the way sad news makes you sad. It lands in your body as something closer to the actual experience of grief, and it stays there long after the person who originated it has moved on. You carry emotional states that do not belong to you. You move through your day processing feelings that were never originally yours, absorbing the weight of people who came to you for support and left lighter, because some of what they were carrying transferred. The cost of that generosity is paid in a currency that nobody can see being spent. The absorption often happens below conscious awareness. You do not decide to take on another person's emotional state. It occurs automatically, and you often do not realize it has happened until you are alone afterward. Sitting with a heaviness that seems disproportionate to your own circumstances, feeling grief or anxiety or a flat, diffuse sadness you cannot source clearly, because it did not start in you. Absorption is not weakness. It is what happens when profound relational capacity develops without the corresponding infrastructure for self-preservation. And the exhaustion it generates is the exhaustion of a self that has been giving its interior resources to the emotional ecology of everyone around it, quietly, continuously, and for far longer than anyone ever realized. The loneliness inside connection. There is a loneliness that does not announce itself clearly. It does not arrive in empty rooms or in stretches of time spent without other people. It arrives in the middle of conversations, at tables surrounded by people you know, in the aftermath of interactions that looked, from the outside, like genuine connection. It is the loneliness of being present and still somehow unreached, of participating in the ordinary social rituals of closeness, while carrying the quiet awareness that the version of you being received is not quite the version that actually exists. This defies the ordinary framework for what loneliness is supposed to mean. Loneliness is generally understood as the absence of connection, something that resolves when sufficient contact is restored. But the contact is present. The relationships are real. The people in your life are not absent or uncaring. And still the loneliness persists, specific and interior, in a place that other people's presence does not reliably reach. You operate at a level of emotional and perceptual depth that most social environments were not designed to sustain. The quality of presence you are hungry to receive in return requires a matching capacity in the other person, and that capacity is not common, not because people are unwilling, but because most people do not process relational experience at the resolution you process it. You can feel that gap immediately, in the slight flatness of a conversation that is pleasant but not quite alive in the way you know conversation can be alive. So you adapt. You meet people at the depth they are able to go. You bring your full care to every interaction, even when it does not reach the places in you that most need to be reached. The people around you often experience your relationship as warm and present and real, while you experience it as warm and present and real, and also incomplete, in a way you have likely stopped trying to explain. Your capacity for understanding others is precisely what makes the asymmetry so visible. You can feel, with considerable accuracy, how much of you is actually landing in any given interaction. The gap between being known and being merely liked is not something you can easily pretend not to notice, and the noticing carries a weight that accumulates in the same quiet, invisible way that all the other costs of your awareness accumulate. Overthinking as a nervous system response. You did not arrive in the world as an overthinker. You were shaped into one gradually by conditions that taught your nervous system something precise, that the present moment was not always safe to inhabit fully, and that thinking further ahead than where you currently were was a form of protection worth the cost. The thinking was never the problem. The problem was the environment that made it necessary, and the fact that the nervous system kept applying the lesson long after the original conditions had changed. What is actually happening is this. A nervous system shaped in conditions of emotional unpredictability wired itself to run continuous anticipatory simulations, trying to model what was coming before it arrived, so that the arrival would not catch you entirely unprepared. The brain prioritizes predicting the emotional environment because the emotional environment was, at some sufficiently early point, something that required prediction for safety. The thinking is surveillance. It always has been. The same sensitivity that allows you to read a room, to detect what is not being said, to feel the emotional state of people around you before they have expressed it consciously, also feeds the anticipatory system. You are running your perceptual system forward in time, projecting emotional trajectories, preparing for outcomes before they arrive. A system designed for emotional prediction does not have a clean-off switch, and it will generate simulations of future difficulty whether or not the present situation actually warrants them. This is why advice to simply stop overthinking so rarely produces lasting relief. The nervous system is not overthinking because it failed to choose differently. It is overthinking because it learned at a level beneath conscious decision that continuous anticipatory processing was the price of emotional safety. A protective system does not release that behavior based on intellectual instruction. It releases when enough experience of the present moment as genuinely safe accumulates. The thoughts are not the enemy. They are the signal, and the most productive relationship with them is not suppression but understanding, recognizing them as the output of a protective system doing what it was trained to do. The weight of holding everyone together. You did not apply for the role. It simply became true gradually that you were the person others came to, the one who could be trusted with emotional weight that had nowhere else to go, whose presence made people feel steadier. This happened because you were genuinely good at it, and because being good at something visible tends to mean you are called upon to do it repeatedly, until the calling upon becomes the expectation, embedded so deeply that neither you nor they could easily name the moment when it calcified into structure. The problem is not the caring itself. The problem is the invisible asymmetry at the center of nearly every significant relationship you have ever had, where your capacity for emotional containment became so reliably available that it gradually left almost no room for the traffic to flow the other way. The people who came to you with their difficulty generally did not know what to do with yours, not because they were careless, but because the version of you they had access to was already managing, already composed, already holding the weight with practiced steadiness. They had never seen you not holding, and you had become extraordinarily skilled at carrying your own difficulty invisibly, processing it in the spaces between interactions, and presenting a surface that remained, as far as anyone could observe, entirely functional. The consequence, running long enough, is the exhaustion of chronic asymmetry, where the giving flows consistently in one direction, and the receiving never quite arrives in the form that would actually replenish what was spent. You can be surrounded by people who care about you and still feel, at the level where it matters, that there is no one to go to, not because the people are absent, but because the relational structure formed around your capacity has made it practically very difficult for anyone to occupy the receiving position in relation to you, and psychologically very difficult for you to let them. A belief formed that was never fully examined, that your emotional reality was a burden, that asking for the kind of reception you needed was asking for something unreasonable. So you didn't ask. You continued holding. The identity you built around not burdening anyone. At some point early enough that you cannot locate it precisely in memory, you received information about the relationship between your emotional reality and the people around you. It arrived across time in accumulated small moments, in the faces of people who did not quite know what to do when you were too much, in the subtle shifts in atmosphere that told you, without words, that your full presence was creating a difficulty you had the power to relieve by becoming slightly less. You were perceptive enough to read that information accurately, and adaptive enough to act on it before anyone ever had to say it directly. What formed was not a behavioral adjustment. It went deeper, into the architecture of how you understood yourself in relation to other people. The belief that crystallized below conscious articulation was precise. Your emotional depth was a weight that others would eventually find too heavy, and the responsible thing to do was to carry as much of it yourself as possible, to become the version of yourself that required the least from the world around you. This belief became the foundation of an identity. You became someone who did not complain, who handled things independently, who could be counted on to manage their own emotional experience without requiring others to manage it with them. You wore the identity well. It attracted a particular kind of admiration, given to people who seem reliably composed, who do not create difficulty, who are present for others without apparently asking for presence in return. What it cost was access to yourself. When the reflex of containment becomes automatic enough, it begins operating before you can observe it, intercepting the full experience before it surfaces into consciousness, replacing it with the managed version so efficiently that you sometimes lose contact with what was actually there. You become someone who often does not know what they are feeling, not because you are emotionally undeveloped, but because the developmental process that should have connected you to your own emotional experience was redirected, early and thoroughly, toward reading and managing the emotional experiences of everyone else. The exhaustion that comes from this is different from all the other layers. It is the exhaustion of self-erasure, of being in the world in a way that is always slightly less than your actual size. The adaptation was not a failure. It was intelligence applied to real conditions. But adaptations built for specific conditions do not dissolve automatically when those conditions change. They persist as identity, until something creates enough safety to make the adaptation recognizable as what it always actually was. A survival strategy built by someone who concluded, without anyone meaning to teach them this, that the price of belonging was becoming less. What exhaustion is actually trying to say? There is a kind of signal that a system sends when it has been running beyond its sustainable parameters for long enough that ordinary maintenance can no longer address the accumulation. It does not arrive as crisis, at least not initially. It arrives as a quality of flatness, a reduced responsiveness, a progressive narrowing of what feels accessible or alive. What you may not have recognized is that it is also something else. The most honest communication your interior life has been able to transmit through the layers of management and performance and containment that have been filtering everything else. The exhaustion is not primarily about what you have been doing. It is about the gap between what you have been experiencing and what you have been permitting yourself to express, process, and receive acknowledgment for. Every room you read without anyone knowing you were reading it. Every emotional weight you absorbed without anyone knowing it, transferred. Every need you routed through the belief that expressing it would burden someone. The exhaustion is the accumulation of all of that gap, compounded across years, quietly and faithfully tracked by a system that was always aware of the full cost, even when nothing in the external environment acknowledged it. The most common response is to treat this kind of exhaustion as a resource problem. More sleep, more rest, better boundaries. Those things are not useless. But they address the surface symptom without touching the underlying source, because the source is not a deficit of rest. It is a deficit of authenticity, of alignment between interior experience and exterior expression, of existing in relationships where the full weight of who you are can be brought forward without being edited into something smaller first. The exhaustion is not your enemy. It is the most loyal part of you, refusing to pretend the accumulation is not accumulating. It is not breakdown. It is direction. It is the interior life using the only language still available to it, saying, something needs to change, not out there, in the architecture of how you are inhabiting yourself. The return to yourself. This is not a resolution that arrives cleanly. There is no moment where the years of accumulated containment dissolve, and the original self reemerges fully formed, uncomplicated by everything that shaped it. What is available is something more honest, a gradual, imperfect reorientation toward yourself that does not erase the history, but changes your relationship to it. The first and most foundational shift is from experiencing your emotional depth as a problem to be managed into recognizing it as the actual structure of who you are. Not a gift to be celebrated in the motivational sense, but the honest acknowledgement that this is the resolution at which you perceive the world, and that none of the exhaustion it generates was ever evidence that something was wrong with you. The exhaustion was evidence that something was wrong with the arrangement. The return begins with the slow relearning of what your own signal actually feels like beneath the management layer. The management became reflexive enough that it now operates faster than conscious awareness in many contexts, filtering the interior experience before you have had a chance to register what it actually was. The work is not dramatic. It is the quiet, patient practice of pausing before the filter engages, of asking what is actually present rather than accepting the managed version as the full account. The return also requires a revision of the belief that formed the foundation of the identity, built around not burdening anyone. Intellectual understanding does not touch the wiring. What touches it is experience. The lived experience of expressing something genuine and having it received without the feared consequence materializing, of asking for something real and finding that the relationship survives and often deepens rather than fracturing under the weight you feared it could not hold. Those relationships exist. Finding them and allowing them to function as corrective experience rather than simply as more context for performance is part of what the return requires. The return to yourself is not about becoming someone with less awareness. The awareness was never the problem, and attempting to reduce it produces its own particular damage. The return is about learning to carry it differently, with the structural support that was always missing, with relationships that can hold more of your real weight, with a clearer and more honest relationship to your own interior. You were not built wrong. You were built for a depth that most people around you were never required to reach. And the exhaustion you have felt, for longer than you can remember, was never weakness. It was the price of perceiving something real in a world that preferred not to look that closely. The price was real, and so was everything you saw.